The doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and every head turned at once. Eleanor Hartley felt her stomach twist as hundreds of eyes fell on her like a wave of cold water. She had not even taken 3 steps into the room, and already she could hear the whispers starting. Is that the Hartley girl? Goodness, she must be nearly 30 by now. Still unmarried. What a shame for her family. Eleanor kept her chin high, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She had worn her best gown, a deep blue silk that her mother had insisted would bring her luck tonight, but no gown, however fine, could hide what the entire kingdom already believed about her. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and in the eyes of high society, she was finished, a woman who had missed her chance. An old maid, they called her, though never to her face, always behind fans, always in hushed voices meant to be heard. Her mother, Margaret Hartley, gripped her arm tightly as they walked deeper into the ballroom. "Smile, dear," Margaret whispered through her own forced smile. "Tonight could be your last real chance." Eleanor did not answer. She had heard this speech so many times that the words no longer stung the way they once had. Tonight was the royal ball, the grandest event of the year, hosted to celebrate the king's birthday. Every noble family in the land had been invited, and every unmarried daughter had been paraded through those doors, hoping to catch the eye of a lord, a count, or if fortune smiled upon them, the duke himself. The ballroom glittered with candlelight. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of gold, and the floor shone so brightly that Eleanor could almost see her own reflection in it. Musicians played softly near the far wall, and couples were already beginning to gather for the first dance. It was beautiful. It was also, for Eleanor, one of the loneliest places in the world. She found a quiet spot near one of the tall windows, away from the crowd, and tried to steady her breathing. She had come tonight only because her mother had begged her, had cried, had reminded her that her younger sister was already engaged, and that soon Eleanor would be the only unmarried daughter left in the family. The weight of that expectation sat on her shoulders like a stone. "There she is," a voice said nearby, sharp and clear enough for Eleanor to hear every word. The old maid of Hartley Manor. Eleanor's spine stiffened. She knew that voice. She turned slightly and saw a group of young women approaching, led by Lady Priscilla Vane, the most celebrated beauty of the season. Priscilla was only 20, with golden curls and a smile that could charm a room, though Eleanor had learned long ago that the smile hid something far less pleasant underneath. "Lady Eleanor," Priscilla said sweetly, stopping just a few feet away, her friends gathering behind her like a small, cruel army. "How lovely to see you here again. I confess I did not expect it." "Why would that be, Lady Priscilla?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice calm. "Well," Priscilla said, glancing at her friends with a small smirk, "one does wonder why a woman of your age still bothers with balls at all. Surely you know by now that no one is coming for you." A few soft laughs rippled through the group behind her. Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm, but she did not look away. "I attend because I was invited," Eleanor said simply. "The same as you." "Invited, yes," Priscilla replied, tilting her head. "But invited to dance, or invited to watch the rest of us dance? There is a difference, you know." More laughter. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she refused to let it show on her face. She had endured this kind of treatment for years now, ever since she had turned 25 and remained unmarried, while every other girl her age had already found husbands. At first it had hurt terribly. Now it simply felt like a weight she carried everywhere she went, heavy but familiar. "Perhaps," Eleanor said quietly, "I simply have not yet met someone worth dancing with." Priscilla's eyes narrowed slightly at the calm response, clearly having expected tears or silence instead. "How very confident of you," she said, though her tone had lost some of its sweetness. "Tell me, Eleanor, do you truly believe someone will still want you, at your age, with your modest dowry? The gentlemen of this kingdom want youth and beauty and fortune. You offer none of those things anymore." The words landed harder than Eleanor expected. She had heard cruel things before, but there was something about tonight, about the crowded ballroom and the watching eyes, that made this moment feel sharper than the others. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. "Leave her be, Priscilla," said a soft voice from behind Eleanor. It was Charlotte Bell, one of the few friends Eleanor had kept over the years, a gentle woman, with kind brown eyes, who had never once mocked her for her unmarried state. "Oh, Charlotte," Priscilla said, waving a dismissive hand. "Always defending the hopeless cases. It is rather sweet of you, really." Eleanor felt Charlotte's hand find hers and give it a small squeeze, a silent gesture of support. But even that small kindness could not erase the sting of Priscilla's words, which seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Across the room, near the grand entrance, a new wave of whispers began to spread. Eleanor barely noticed at first, still trying to steady herself after the confrontation, but slowly, she became aware that the entire ballroom's attention had shifted. "The Duke has arrived," someone murmured. Eleanor turned, along with nearly everyone else in the room, to see Duke Alexander Whitmore step through the grand doors. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious expression that seemed permanently fixed on his face, as though he found little joy in gatherings such as this one. He was, without question, the most eligible bachelor in the entire kingdom, and every unmarried woman present straightened her posture the moment he entered. Alexander scanned the room with a practiced, distant gaze. He had attended countless balls just like this one, and each felt more tiresome than the last. Mothers pushed their daughters toward him. Young women batted their lashes and laughed too loudly at anything he said. He had grown weary of the performance of it all, the way everyone seemed to want something from him, rather than simply wanting to know him. He accepted a glass from a passing servant and began to walk the perimeter of the room, nodding politely to those who greeted him, though his mind was elsewhere. He had come tonight only because his mother, the Duchess, had insisted, reminding him that duty required his presence at the king's birthday celebration. It was then that he noticed her. Near the tall windows, standing slightly apart from the crowd, was a woman he did not recognize. She was not laughing too loudly or batting her lashes in his direction. In fact, she seemed entirely unaware of his presence, her attention instead fixed on steadying herself after what appeared to be an unpleasant exchange with a group of younger women. There was something in the way she held herself, straight-backed despite clear distress, that caught his attention, in a way none of the eager smiles around him ever had. He watched as the young women eventually drifted away, whispering among themselves, leaving the woman standing alone with only one companion beside her. Alexander found himself curious, though he could not quite explain why. "Who is that?" he asked quietly, turning to Lord Henry Ashby, an old friend who had accompanied him that evening. Henry followed his gaze. "Ah, that would be Lady Eleanor Hartley," he said. "Poor woman. She has become something of a favorite target for the younger set this season. They call her the old maid, though I confess I find the whole business rather unkind." "Why is she treated so poorly?" Alexander asked, unable to look away. "She is nearly 30 and unmarried," Henry explained with a small shrug. "In this crowd, that is considered a kind of failure. Society does not forgive a woman for remaining unwed past a certain age, however unfair that may be." Alexander said nothing, but something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. He had spent years being pursued by women who wanted his title, his fortune, his name. And here was a woman being mocked simply for existing without a husband attached to her identity. There was something deeply wrong with that, he thought, though he could not yet say why it bothered him so much. He continued to watch her from across the room. She had composed herself now, standing quietly beside her friend, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the dance floor, with an expression that Alexander could not quite read. Not longing exactly. Something more complicated than that. Perhaps resignation. He found himself wanting to cross the room and speak with her, though such a thing would surely draw unwanted attention and start 100 new rumors. Dukes did not simply approach unmarried women without reason, especially not ones already the subject of so much gossip. And yet the pull he felt was strange and insistent, unlike anything he had experienced at any ball before this one. Before he could decide what to do, a commotion near the refreshment table drew his attention away. Lady Priscilla Vane had returned, this time with an even larger group trailing behind her, and Alexander could see immediately that she was heading straight back toward Eleanor Hartley, with a look of wicked delight on her face. "This should be entertaining," one of the young men near Alexander muttered to his companion, loud enough for Alexander to hear. "Priscilla never lets a good joke go unfinished." Alexander felt a strange, protective instinct rise within him, one he had never felt for a stranger before. He did not know this woman. He had exchanged no words with her, learned nothing of her character beyond what Henry had briefly explained. And yet something told him that whatever was about to happen at those refreshment tables was going to matter a great deal, not just to Eleanor Hartley, but to him as well. He set down his glass and began to walk in that direction, though he told himself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. Across the room, Priscilla's voice rose again, sharp and confident, cutting through the music and chatter like a blade. "Lady Eleanor," she called out, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "I have had the most wonderful idea." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She recognized that tone immediately, the one Priscilla used whenever she was about to say something designed to humiliate rather than entertain. Around her, conversations began to quiet as more guests turned to watch, sensing that something was about to happen. "What idea is that?" Eleanor asked carefully, though she already dreaded the answer. Priscilla smiled, slow and sharp as a blade catching candlelight. "Since you clearly have no dance partner tonight, and likely none forthcoming," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "perhaps you could entertain us in some other way. Sing for us, Lady Eleanor. Show the room what talents you have been hiding all these years, since a husband certainly does not appear to be among them." The cruelty of the suggestion rippled through the crowd. Some guests gasped softly, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few, cut from the same cloth as Priscilla, could not hide their amused smiles, eager to see the old maid humiliated in front of the entire kingdom. Eleanor felt her whole body go cold. She had never sung in front of anyone outside her own family, not once in her entire life. Singing had always been her private comfort, something she did alone in her room at Hartley Manor, when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. It was hers alone, untouched by the world's judgment. And now Priscilla wanted to strip that away from her too, to turn her one private joy into another public humiliation. "I do not think that is necessary," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Oh, come now," Priscilla pressed, sensing victory. "Do not be shy. Or is it that you simply have no talents at all? No husband, no dowry to speak of, and now no voice either? What exactly do you have to offer, Lady Eleanor?" The room had gone almost completely silent now, every eye fixed on Eleanor as she stood frozen near the refreshment table, humiliation burning through her like fire. She could feel her mother watching from across the room, could see the pity and shame mixed together on Margaret's face. She thought of turning and walking straight out of the ballroom, of never returning to another gathering like this one for as long as she lived. But something inside her, some small ember that had never quite gone out despite years of being told she was worthless, refused to let her run. Slowly, Eleanor lifted her chin and looked directly at Priscilla Vane. "Very well," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her chest. "I will sing." The words seemed to hang in the air of the silent ballroom, and across the room, though Eleanor did not yet know it, Duke Alexander Whitmore had stopped walking entirely, his full attention now fixed on the quiet woman by the windows who had just agreed to step into the center of everyone's judgment. Whatever happened next, Eleanor understood, would change everything. Eleanor's legs felt heavy as she stepped away from the refreshment table and walked toward the small platform where the musicians sat, their instruments now silent, waiting. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath around her. She could feel hundreds of eyes following her every movement, some curious, some cruel, some simply hungry for the spectacle Priscilla had promised them. Her mother's face, pale with worry, flashed briefly in her mind as she passed. Margaret had not tried to stop her. Perhaps she understood, in some quiet way, that Eleanor needed to do this, needed to prove something to herself, even more than to the crowd watching her. Charlotte Bell caught Eleanor's sleeve gently as she passed. "You do not have to do this," Charlotte whispered urgently. "Let us leave. No one would blame you." "I would blame myself," Eleanor whispered back, and continued walking. When she reached the small raised platform where the musicians waited, the head musician, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gray mustache, leaned toward her. "What shall we play, my lady?" he asked softly, his voice free of the mockery that filled the rest of the room. Eleanor hesitated only a moment. There was one song, an old melody her grandmother had taught her many years ago, before illness had taken the older woman from the family. It was a song about loss and hope, about a woman who waited through long winters for spring to return. Eleanor had sung it 1,000 times alone in her bedroom, letting the words carry away whatever sadness had gathered in her chest that day. She had never imagined singing it here, in front of the very people who had spent years telling her she was unwanted. "The winter rose," she said quietly. "Do you know it?" The old musician's eyes softened with recognition. "I do, my lady. A beautiful and difficult piece." "Are you certain?" Eleanor took a slow breath and nodded. "I am certain." The musicians exchanged glances, then began to play a soft, gentle introduction on the strings, a melody that immediately calmed some of the chatter still rippling through the crowd. Priscilla stood near the front of the gathered guests, arms crossed, an expectant smirk still fixed on her face, clearly certain that whatever came next would only add to Eleanor's humiliation. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the music settle into her bones the way it always had, ever since she was a small girl sitting at her grandmother's feet. When she opened them again, something in her had shifted. The fear was still there, curled tight in her stomach, but beneath it was something stronger, something that had been waiting years for this exact moment to finally be set free. She began to sing. Her voice, when it emerged, was not loud, not showy in the way some of the room might have expected. It was soft at first, delicate and pure, carrying the opening notes of the melody with a tenderness that seemed to still every whisper in the ballroom almost instantly. Then, as the song built, so did her voice, rising with a clarity and emotion that seemed to fill every corner of the grand hall, reaching even the highest chandeliers and echoing softly off the tall windows. The room, which had been buzzing with cruel anticipation only moments before, fell into complete and utter silence. Even the servants near the walls stopped their quiet movements to listen. Priscilla's smirk began to falter, then faded entirely, replaced by something like confusion and disbelief. This was not the humiliating performance she had expected. This was something else entirely, something none of them had prepared for. Eleanor's voice carried the sorrow and hope of the song's story perfectly, each note shaped with a depth of feeling that could only come from someone who had truly lived through loneliness, and had somehow, against all odds, kept a small flame of hope alive within her heart. Her eyes remained closed as she sang, lost entirely in the music, in the memory of her grandmother's gentle hands, in every quiet night she had spent alone, believing herself forgotten by the world. Across the ballroom, Duke Alexander Whitmore stood absolutely still, his glass forgotten in his hand, his entire attention consumed by the voice filling the air around him. He had attended the finest operas in the capital, had listened to trained singers brought from distant lands to perform for the royal family. He had never, in all his years, heard anything quite like this. There was a rawness to Eleanor's voice, an honesty that no amount of training could ever teach, that seemed to reach directly into his chest and settle there. He found himself moving closer without quite deciding to do so, drawn forward through the crowd as though pulled by some invisible thread. Around him, other guests were doing the same, drifting toward the platform, their earlier cruelty and gossip forgotten entirely in the presence of something truly beautiful. Eleanor's voice rose to the song's final, aching notes, and the entire ballroom seemed to lean forward together, caught in the spell of it. When the last note finally faded into silence, hanging delicately in the air for a long moment, there was nothing, no sound at all. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, half expecting to see the same mocking faces she had left behind only minutes earlier. Instead, she saw astonishment. Then, from somewhere near the back of the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom had erupted into enthusiastic applause, far louder and more genuine than anything Eleanor had ever received in her life. Several guests called out words of praise. Others simply stared, stunned into silence, even amid the applause around them. Eleanor stood frozen on the platform, overwhelmed by the sudden shift, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She searched the crowd instinctively for her mother, and found Margaret standing near the edge of the room, tears streaming freely down her face, her hands pressed against her chest in disbelief and pride. Near the front of the crowd, Priscilla Vane stood absolutely still, her face pale, her earlier confidence completely shattered. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. The old maid was supposed to be humiliated, supposed to slink away in shame while the room laughed. Instead, she had just delivered the single most captivating performance the royal ball had seen in years. "Well," Priscilla managed weakly, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How unexpected." But her words were lost beneath the continued applause, and no one around her seemed to be paying attention to anything she said any longer. Through the crowd, moving with quiet purpose, came Duke Alexander Whitmore. He did not stop until he stood directly before the platform, looking up at Eleanor, with an expression she could not quite read, something between wonder and deep respect. "That," he said, his voice carrying easily now that the room had quieted somewhat, "was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush warm, uncertain how to respond to praise from a man she had never even spoken with before, let alone one so highly regarded throughout the kingdom. "Your Grace," she managed, offering a small, uncertain curtsy as she stepped down from the platform. "You are too kind." "I am not being kind," Alexander said simply, his dark eyes steady on hers in a way that made her chest tighten strangely. "I am being honest." "Where did you learn to sing like that?" "My grandmother taught me," Eleanor said, still slightly breathless from the performance and the unexpected attention now surrounding her. "It was never meant to be performed. It was simply something I did for myself." "Then the world has been deprived of something wonderful for far too long," Alexander said, and though his tone remained composed, there was a warmth beneath his words that Eleanor had not expected from a man known throughout society for his cold, distant manner. Around them, the crowd continued to murmur, many guests now approaching to offer their own praise, their earlier whispers of mockery entirely forgotten, replaced by admiration. Eleanor felt dizzy with the sudden reversal, unable to fully process how quickly the evening had transformed from her deepest humiliation into something she could never have imagined. Priscilla, watching from a short distance away, felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as she observed the Duke's clear fascination with the woman she had spent the entire season mocking. This was not jealousy exactly, or perhaps it was exactly that, though Priscilla would never have admitted such a thing to herself. She had spent years being told she was the most beautiful, most desirable woman in the kingdom, and now the most eligible bachelor in the land stood transfixed before a woman she had dismissed as worthless only moments before. "Lady Eleanor," Alexander said, drawing her attention back to him, his voice quieter now, meant only for her ears despite the crowd still gathered nearby. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" The question hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter strangely in her chest. A request like this, from a man like him, was something she had never once allowed herself to imagine, not even in her most private daydreams. Around them, she could hear the sharp intake of breath from several nearby guests, could sense the ripple of shock spreading outward through the ballroom as word of the Duke's request began to travel. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, though inside her chest, a storm of disbelief and cautious hope was building with each passing second. Alexander extended his hand, and Eleanor placed her own trembling fingers within his grasp, allowing him to lead her toward the center of the dance floor as the musicians began a new, gentle melody. The crowd parted to make way for them, whispers following in their wake, though these whispers now carried a very different tone than they had only minutes before. As they began to dance, moving in slow, careful steps around the polished floor, Eleanor could feel the weight of countless eyes upon them, could sense the shift happening throughout the entire ballroom, as the story of what had just occurred began to spread from guest to guest like wildfire. She barely noticed any of it. Her attention was entirely consumed by the man before her, by the steady warmth of his hand against hers, by the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the entire grand hall. "You surprised me tonight," Alexander said quietly as they moved together across the floor. "I surprised myself as well," Eleanor admitted, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the tension she had carried all evening. "I have never sung in front of anyone before tonight." "Then I am fortunate to have witnessed it," he replied, and something in the sincerity of his tone made Eleanor's chest ache with an unfamiliar warmth she could not quite name. Across the room, Margaret Hartley watched her daughter dance with the Duke of the Realm, tears still glistening in her eyes, hardly daring to believe what she was witnessing. For years she had worried about Eleanor's future, had pushed and pleaded and worried herself sick over her daughter's unmarried state. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined a night like this one unfolding before her. Near the refreshment tables, Priscilla Vane turned sharply away from the dance floor, unable to watch any longer, her mind already spinning with plans to somehow undo whatever had just begun between the Duke and the woman she had spent the entire season trying to destroy. This was not over, she told herself firmly. Whatever had happened tonight, she would find a way to make certain it did not last. But for now, in the center of the glittering ballroom, Eleanor Hartley danced in the arms of a duke, who looked at her not as an old maid to be pitied or mocked, but as someone entirely, wonderfully unexpected, and for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The dance ended, but the music that had drawn them together did not seem to fade with it. Alexander kept Eleanor's hand a moment longer than etiquette required, and she did not pull away. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, "away from all these eyes, if only for a few minutes." Eleanor glanced around the crowded ballroom, aware of how many people were still watching them, still whispering behind fans and gloved hands. A small part of her worried what such a walk might mean for her reputation, but a larger part of her, the part that had spent years being invisible, did not want this evening to end just yet. "I would like that, Your Grace," she said. He led her toward a set of tall glass doors that opened onto a stone balcony, overlooking the palace gardens. The night air was cool and fragrant, with the scent of blooming roses, a welcome relief after the heat and noise of the ballroom. Below them, the gardens stretched out in neat, moonlit rows, hedges trimmed into elegant shapes, fountains catching the silver light. "You may call me Alexander, if you wish," he said once they were alone, leaning against the stone railing. "At least when we are not surrounded by half the kingdom." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Then you may call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "Tell me something. Why have I never seen you at a ball before tonight?" "I have attended a great many of these gatherings, and I feel certain I would have remembered a voice like yours." Eleanor looked out over the gardens, choosing her words carefully. "I have attended balls before, Your Grace, Alexander. I simply have never been." "Noticed, not in the way you mean." "That seems difficult to believe," he said. "It is easier to believe than you might think," Eleanor replied, a note of old sadness creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to keep it hidden. "When a woman reaches a certain age without marrying, she becomes something of a ghost at these events. People look through her, not at her. I stopped expecting anything different a long time ago." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "That is a terrible thing for anyone to accept as normal," he said finally. "You have a gift most people would give anything to possess, and instead of being celebrated for it, you were nearly humiliated tonight because of unkind assumptions about your worth." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat at his words. No one, not even her own mother, had ever spoken so plainly about the unfairness of what she had endured. "It is simply how things are," she said softly. "A woman without a husband, without children, is considered to have failed at the only purpose society believes she has. It does not matter what else she might offer the world." "I disagree entirely," Alexander said, his voice firm. "A person's worth is not measured by whether or not they have secured a marriage by a certain age. That is a foolish, narrow way of looking at a person's value, and I have grown tired of watching this society apply it so cruelly, particularly to women." Eleanor turned to look at him fully now, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "That is not what I expected to hear from a duke," she admitted. "Perhaps that is because most dukes have never had to sit through years of mothers thrusting their daughters at them, judging each young woman not for her character or her kindness, but for her beauty, her dowry, her family connections," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "I have grown rather cynical about the entire process, if I am honest. Tonight was the first time in a very long while that I felt genuinely moved by something at one of these gatherings." "By my singing," Eleanor said. "By your singing," he agreed, "and by your courage. It takes a great deal of strength to stand before a room full of people who have mocked you and give them something beautiful instead of running away." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again, unused to such direct and sincere praise. "I nearly did run away," she confessed, "if not for a small, stubborn part of myself that refused to let Priscilla win so easily." "I am glad that part of you won instead," Alexander said quietly. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of music and laughter drifting out from the ballroom behind them, mixing with the gentle rustle of the garden below. Eleanor found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, the sharp line of his jaw, the thoughtful furrow between his brows, He did not look at her the way other suitors had looked at previous, younger women she had watched being courted over the years, with calculating eyes weighing dowries and family connections. He looked at her as though genuinely curious about who she was. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said after a while. "Of course. Why did you truly come speak with me tonight? Surely there were a dozen younger, more suitable women you might have chosen to dance with instead." Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "I have danced with a great many women who wanted my title, my fortune, or simply the prestige of being seen with me," he said. "None of them ever moved me the way your voice did tonight. When you sang, I did not see a woman trying to secure a match or prove her worth to a room full of strangers. I saw someone singing from somewhere deep and true within herself, without any performance in it at all. That is a rare thing, Eleanor, rarer than you might know." Eleanor did not know how to respond to such honesty, so instead she simply allowed herself to accept it, to let the warmth of his words settle into the places that years of quiet loneliness had left cold and guarded. Their conversation continued for what felt like only a few minutes but had, in truth, stretched on for nearly half an hour, covering everything from her love of music to his responsibilities managing his family's estates, from her fondness for long walks through the countryside near Hartley Manor to his quiet dream, rarely spoken aloud, of one day finding a marriage built on genuine understanding, rather than obligation and strategic advantage. Eventually, a servant appeared at the balcony doors to inform Alexander that his mother, the Dowager Duchess, was asking after him. Alexander sighed softly, clearly reluctant to end their conversation. "I should return," he said, "though I find myself wishing the evening did not have to end quite yet." "Thank you for the dance," Eleanor said, "and for this conversation. I have not spoken so freely with anyone in a very long time." "Then let us speak freely again," Alexander said, his tone suddenly earnest. "May I call upon you, Eleanor, at Hartley Manor?" The question caught her entirely off guard. Suitors did not call upon women like her, women considered too old, too plain by society's harsh standards, too far past the age of desirability. And yet here stood the most eligible duke in the kingdom, asking with genuine hope in his eyes. "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, scarcely daring to believe the words as she spoke them. Alexander smiled then, a real smile that softened the serious lines of his face and made him look, for just a moment, much younger and far less burdened by the weight of his title. "Then I shall call upon you soon," he promised. They returned to the ballroom together, and though countless eyes followed their re-entry, tracking every small detail of their expressions and the careful distance they now kept between them, Eleanor found she cared far less than she once might have. For the remainder of the evening, she was approached by several other guests, some offering genuine praise for her singing, others simply curious about the sudden change in her standing within the room. Even a few of the young women who had once whispered cruel things behind her back now offered stiff, uncertain compliments, clearly recalculating their opinion of her, now that the Duke himself had shown such clear interest. Priscilla Vane, however, remained conspicuously absent from these well-wishers, watching instead from a shadowed corner of the ballroom with an expression that had curdled from disbelief into something far colder and more calculating. She watched Eleanor laugh softly at something one of the older lords said, watched the easy, genuine way people now gathered around a woman they had dismissed only hours earlier, and felt something bitter twist deep in her chest. This could not be allowed to continue, Priscilla decided. Whatever spell Eleanor Hartley had cast over the Duke tonight, whatever fortunate turn of events had elevated her from mockery to admiration in the span of a single song, Priscilla intended to find a way to undo it entirely. She had spent her whole life being told she was destined for greatness, destined to make the finest match in the kingdom, and she would not allow some overlooked spinster to steal that future away from her, not without a fight. As the ball drew toward its close and carriages began arriving to carry guests home through the cool night air, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how completely the evening had transformed from what she had expected. She had arrived at the royal ball prepared for the same quiet humiliation she had endured for years, ready to be overlooked, mocked, and forgotten by morning. Instead, she was leaving with the promise of a duke's visit ringing in her ears, and something warm and cautiously hopeful blooming in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. Her mother, riding beside her in the carriage back to Hartley Manor, could not stop smiling, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Eleanor's hand, as though needing to confirm that the events of the evening had truly happened, and were not simply a wonderful dream. "I always knew," Margaret said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "that someone would see you for who you truly are, Eleanor. I only worried it might take too long." Eleanor looked out the carriage window at the passing moonlit fields, her heart still racing with the memory of Alexander's steady gaze, his sincere words, the warmth of his hand against hers as they danced. "I worried the same thing, Mother," she admitted quietly. But perhaps it happened at exactly the right time. She did not yet know, as the carriage rolled onward through the quiet night, just how much trouble Lady Priscilla Vane intended to cause in the days and weeks that followed, nor how difficult the road ahead would prove to be. But for tonight, at least, Eleanor allowed herself to simply feel happy, to hold on to the fragile, precious hope that had bloomed so unexpectedly within her chest, and to believe, if only for a little while, that perhaps her story was not over after all. Perhaps it was only just beginning. News of the royal ball traveled faster than any carriage could carry it. By the following afternoon, every household of consequence in the kingdom seemed to know some version of what had happened, though the details grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Some claimed Eleanor Hartley had sung so beautifully that the king himself had wept. Others insisted the Duke had proposed marriage on the spot, right there on the dance floor before the entire court. At Hartley Manor, Eleanor sat in the small parlor, with her needlework resting forgotten in her lap, listening to her mother read aloud from a letter that had just arrived from a distant cousin, already asking breathless questions about the rumors sweeping through the capital. "They are saying you enchanted the entire ballroom," Margaret said, her eyes bright with excitement as she scanned the letter. "Cousin Beatrice writes that even the palace servants have not stopped talking about it." "It was only a song, Mother," Eleanor said, though she could not fully suppress the small smile tugging at her lips. "People are exaggerating." "Perhaps," Margaret said, setting down the letter and studying her daughter with a curious expression. "But the Duke asked to call upon you. That much, at least, is not exaggeration." Eleanor's stomach fluttered nervously at the reminder. It had been 2 days since the ball, and though Alexander had promised to visit, no word had yet arrived confirming when that visit might take place. A small, anxious voice in the back of her mind wondered if perhaps the whole evening had simply been a fleeting moment of kindness on his part, easily forgotten once he returned to the demands of his usual life among the capital's most eligible and beautiful young women. "He may have simply been polite," Eleanor said quietly, giving voice to her worry. "A duke's kindness in the moment does not always translate into lasting intention." "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly, though Eleanor could hear the same underlying anxiety in her mother's voice. "A man like the Duke does not offer to call upon a woman unless he means it. He has no reason to flatter you falsely. He could have any woman in the kingdom." Eleanor said nothing further, though she privately wondered whether that very fact, that Alexander could have any woman he wished, made his interest in her all the more likely to fade once the novelty of the evening wore off. Meanwhile, across the city in a grand townhouse near the palace, Lady Priscilla Vane was engaged in a very different sort of conversation. She sat in her private sitting room with 2 of her closest companions, Lady Sophia Ellery and Lady Margaret Cole, both of whom had witnessed the events of the royal ball firsthand, and were eager to help Priscilla devise some manner of response. "It is simply unbearable," Priscilla said, pacing the length of her sitting room with sharp, agitated steps. "Everyone speaks of nothing else. Eleanor Hartley, of all people, being courted by the Duke of Whitmore. It is absurd." "Perhaps it will not last," Sophia offered carefully. "These sudden fascinations often fade quickly enough." "I do not intend to leave it to chance," Priscilla said, stopping abruptly and turning to face her friends with a determined glint in her eye. "There must be something we can do to remind the Duke of what he truly deserves. Someone young, beautiful, and properly connected, not some overlooked spinster who happened to have a pleasant singing voice." "What do you propose?" Margaret Cole asked, leaning forward with interest. Priscilla considered the question carefully, her mind already working through several possibilities. "First," she said slowly, "we must ensure that word of Eleanor's more unfortunate circumstances reaches the Duke's ears. Her family's finances are not what they once were, you know. Her father's investments failed rather badly, some years ago, and the family has been living rather modestly ever since. A man of the Duke's standing surely would not wish to align his family with one facing such difficulties." "That seems rather unkind," Sophia said hesitantly, though she did not press the objection further when Priscilla shot her a sharp look. "Kindness has little to do with securing one's future, Sophia," Priscilla said coldly. "I have spent my entire life preparing to make the finest match this kingdom has ever seen. I will not allow some fortunate accident of circumstance to steal that future from me without a fight." The three women continued plotting for the better part of an hour, Priscilla growing increasingly confident in her scheme as the conversation progressed. She would ensure, through careful and seemingly innocent conversation at various social gatherings over the coming days, that details of the Hartley family's financial struggles reached ears that mattered. She would also, she decided, make certain to remind the Duke's mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Cordelia Whitmore, of the importance of maintaining proper family connections through marriage, connections that a woman like Eleanor Hartley could never hope to provide. Cordelia Whitmore, Priscilla knew, held considerable influence over her son despite his position as head of the family, and she had never been shy about expressing strong opinions regarding suitable matches for the Duke. If Priscilla could plant enough doubt in the Dowager Duchess's mind, perhaps she could turn the tide before Alexander's interest in Eleanor had the chance to grow into anything more serious. 3 days after the ball, as Eleanor sat in the garden at Hartley Manor tending to her mother's roses, a servant came hurrying across the lawn with news that made her heart leap into her throat. "My lady," the young servant said breathlessly, "a carriage approaches. It bears the Duke's crest." Eleanor set down her gardening shears with trembling hands and rose quickly, brushing dirt from her simple day dress, suddenly acutely aware of how unprepared she looked to receive such an important visitor. She had not expected him to call so soon, had begun to convince herself over the past few days that perhaps he had changed his mind entirely. "Fetch my mother," Eleanor instructed, hurrying toward the manor's front entrance, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervous uncertainty. By the time the elegant carriage rolled to a stop before Hartley Manor's modest front steps, Eleanor had managed to smooth her hair and compose herself into something resembling calm dignity, though her hands still trembled slightly at her sides. The carriage door opened, and Alexander stepped down, dressed more casually than she had seen him at the ball, though he still carried himself with the same quiet, confident bearing that had struck her from the very first moment she had noticed him across the crowded ballroom. "Eleanor," he said warmly, approaching with a genuine smile that immediately eased much of her nervous tension, "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient time." "Not at all, Your Grace," Eleanor said, offering a small curtsy. "We are delighted to receive you." "Alexander," he corrected gently, his eyes holding hers with the same steady warmth she remembered from the balcony. "I believe we agreed to dispense with such formality between us." "Alexander," Eleanor repeated, a genuine smile finally breaking through her earlier nervousness. Margaret arrived moments later, flustered but delighted, insisting that Alexander join them for tea in the manor's small but comfortable sitting room. Over the following hour, conversation flowed easily between them, covering everything from the modest beauty of Hartley Manor's gardens to Alexander's own childhood memories of his family's larger, grander estate to the north. Eleanor found herself relaxing more with each passing minute, the careful walls she had built around herself over years of disappointment slowly beginning to soften in the warmth of his genuine attention. "I must confess," Alexander said at one point, glancing around the modestly furnished sitting room, "your home is far more welcoming than many of the grander estates I have visited. There is a warmth here that seems to be missing from a great many wealthier households." "We have had to learn to appreciate simpler comforts in recent years," Margaret said, a note of old worry creeping briefly into her voice before she caught herself and smiled again. "But we have never lacked for love within these walls, even when other things have been in shorter supply." Eleanor watched Alexander's expression carefully, wondering if her mother's comment about their reduced circumstances might change his manner toward her, might introduce the same calculating distance she had witnessed in previous suitors upon learning of her family's modest finances. But his expression remained unchanged, his warm attention still fixed on Eleanor, as though nothing her mother had said mattered to him in the slightest. "Love within a home is worth far more than any fortune," Alexander said simply, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen with relief and growing affection. As the visit drew toward its natural close, Alexander lingered near the front entrance a moment longer than necessary, clearly reluctant to depart. "Might I call upon you again, Eleanor?" he asked, Perhaps we could walk through your gardens properly next time, without the constraint of tea and polite conversation." "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely. After his carriage had departed down the long drive, Margaret turned to her daughter with tears of joy once again gathering in her eyes. "He is truly taken with you," she said softly. "I have never seen a man look at anyone the way he looks at you, Eleanor." Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to believe that perhaps this was real, that perhaps the quiet, hopeful warmth building in her chest was not simply a foolish fantasy destined to be crushed by the harsh realities of the world around her. She did not yet know of the careful, poisonous whispers Priscilla Vane had already begun spreading through the capital's finest drawing rooms, whispers that would soon reach ears far more influential than her own, and threaten to unravel everything that had begun to bloom so beautifully between herself and the Duke. For now, though, standing in the golden afternoon light streaming across her family's modest but beloved gardens, Eleanor allowed herself simply to feel happy, and to hope, cautiously but genuinely, that her story might finally be turning towards something brighter than the quiet loneliness she had grown so accustomed to enduring. Over the following 2 weeks, Alexander called upon Hartley Manor no fewer than 5 times, each visit stretching longer than the last, each conversation revealing new layers of understanding between them. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his arrivals with an eagerness she had never before allowed herself to feel toward any suitor, and she began, slowly and carefully, to trust that this warmth building between them was genuine rather than fleeting. On one particularly pleasant afternoon, they walked together through the gardens behind Hartley Manor, the late summer roses still clinging stubbornly to their blooms, despite the approaching autumn chill. Eleanor pointed out various plants her grandmother had cultivated years earlier, sharing small memories tied to each one, while Alexander listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that revealed how closely he was paying attention. "You speak of your grandmother often," Alexander observed as they paused beside a small stone bench nestled beneath an old oak tree. "She must have meant a great deal to you." "She did," Eleanor said softly, settling onto the bench as Alexander joined her. "She taught me to sing, taught me to love music, in a way that felt like breathing rather than performance. After she passed, singing became the one place I could still feel close to her." "I am sorry for your loss," Alexander said gently. "It is clear she left you with a truly remarkable gift." Eleanor smiled, though it carried a touch of old sadness. "She always told me that a woman's worth was never determined by whether society approved of her choices or her circumstances, but by the honesty and kindness she carried within her heart. I have tried to hold on to that belief, even during the years when it felt easiest to forget it entirely." "Those years sound as though they were difficult," Alexander said carefully, sensing there was more beneath her words than she had yet shared. Eleanor hesitated, then found herself opening up in a way she rarely had with anyone outside her closest family. "When I was 22, I was engaged," she admitted quietly, "to a young lord from a neighboring county. We were meant to marry within the year." Alexander's expression sharpened with surprised interest, though he said nothing, allowing her the space to continue at her own pace. "My father's investments failed rather suddenly that same year," Eleanor continued. "Our family's fortune, once quite substantial, dwindled to almost nothing within a matter of months. My betrothed's family withdrew the engagement soon after, citing concerns about our reduced circumstances. I later learned they had already begun arranging a new match for him with a wealthier family before they had even formally ended things with me." "That is a cruel thing to have endured," Alexander said, his voice tight with quiet anger on her behalf. "It taught me a valuable lesson about how quickly affection can disappear once fortune changes," Eleanor said, though she kept her eyes fixed on the garden rather than meeting his gaze directly. "After that, I found it difficult to trust that anyone's interest in me was genuine rather than calculated. Each season, I watched younger women arrive at balls and gatherings, watched suitors who had once shown interest in me turn their attention elsewhere as I grew older, and our family's circumstances remained modest. Eventually, I simply stopped expecting anything different." Alexander reached over and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I cannot speak for the man who once claimed to love you, and then abandoned you the moment circumstances grew difficult," he said, "but I can promise you that my interest in you has nothing to do with fortune or family connections. I have more wealth than I could ever need in 10 lifetimes. What I have never had is someone who looks at me and sees a person rather than a title. Someone whose company I genuinely crave, rather than simply tolerate out of social obligation. That is what I have found in you, Eleanor." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes at his words, tears born not of sadness, but of a relief so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. She had spent so many years bracing herself against disappointment that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. "Thank you," she managed softly, "for saying that." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, his hand still holding hers, the golden afternoon light filtering gently through the oak leaves above them. It was, Eleanor thought, one of the most peaceful moments she had experienced in years. Their peace, however, would not last uninterrupted for long. Across the city, at the Grand Whitmore family townhouse, the Dowager Duchess Cordelia Whitmore sat in her private study, reading a carefully worded letter that had arrived that morning from an acquaintance who moved in the same social circles as Lady Priscilla Vane. The letter spoke, with practiced subtlety, of concerns regarding the Hartley family's significantly reduced financial circumstances, of old rumors surrounding a broken engagement some years earlier, and of gentle worry that the Duke's evident fascination with Lady Eleanor Hartley might not be entirely wise given the family's diminished standing. Cordelia set the letter down with a troubled frown, her sharp mind immediately beginning to consider the implications. She had heard, of course, the whispers surrounding her son's attentions toward Eleanor Hartley following the royal ball. She had assumed, initially, that it was simply a passing fascination, the kind of momentary interest young men sometimes developed before returning to more sensible considerations. But 5 visits to Hartley Manor in 2 weeks suggested something far more serious than a passing fancy. She had always hoped Alexander would marry someone of impeccable family standing, someone whose connections would strengthen the Whitmore family's already considerable influence throughout the kingdom. A woman from a family whose fortune had collapsed, whose reputation had already suffered years of social mockery regarding her unmarried state, seemed a poor match indeed for a Duke of Alexander's standing, regardless of whatever personal qualities the young woman might possess. Cordelia rang for her assistant and requested that a message be sent to her son, requesting his presence at the townhouse at his earliest convenience. It was time, she decided, that she and Alexander had a serious conversation about his future and the responsibilities that came with his position. 2 days later, Alexander arrived at his mother's study, having anticipated correctly that this conversation would concern Eleanor Hartley. "Mother," he greeted her, settling into the chair across from her desk. "You wish to speak with me?" "I have heard a great deal about your recent attentions toward Lady Eleanor Hartley," Cordelia said without preamble, studying her son's expression carefully. 5 visits in 2 weeks is not the behavior of a man merely being polite, Alexander. "No," Alexander agreed simply. "It is not." "I understand her singing voice caught your attention at the ball," Cordelia continued, "and I do not doubt she possesses genuine talent. But Alexander, you must consider the practical realities of such a match. Her family's finances collapsed years ago. She has already suffered a broken engagement due to those very circumstances. Society already views her with a certain pity, and I fear aligning yourself too closely with her situation could invite unwanted scrutiny and gossip that reflects poorly on our family's standing." "Mother," Alexander said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable firmness, "I have spent years enduring the company of women who cared nothing for me personally, who saw only my title and fortune and calculated their every word and gesture accordingly. Eleanor has never once sought anything from me beyond genuine conversation and companionship. Her family's financial circumstances are irrelevant to the qualities that matter most to me in choosing a wife." "Irrelevant to you, perhaps," Cordelia pressed, "but not irrelevant to the family's reputation, nor to the responsibilities you carry as Duke. Marriage is not simply a matter of personal affection, Alexander. It is a strategic decision that affects our entire family's standing and influence. I understand the responsibilities of my position better than most, Mother," Alexander said, his tone growing sharper despite his effort to remain composed. "I have shouldered them faithfully since Father's passing, but I will not allow those responsibilities to dictate who I choose to love, particularly when the woman in question possesses more genuine kindness, courage, and integrity than half the fortune-seeking women who have paraded themselves before me these past several years." Cordelia studied her son for a long moment, recognizing the same stubborn determination she had witnessed in his late father on more than one occasion. She was not entirely unmoved by his passionate defense of Eleanor, though her practical concerns regarding the family's reputation remained firmly in place. "I will not forbid you from pursuing this relationship, Alexander," she said finally. "You are a grown man, and the head of this family, fully capable of making your own decisions. But I urge you to consider carefully what such a match might mean, not only for yourself, but for Lady Eleanor as well. Society can be exceedingly cruel toward those it perceives as having overstepped their proper station, and I fear the scrutiny surrounding this relationship, should it continue and grow more serious, could prove exceedingly difficult for her to endure." Alexander considered his mother's words carefully, recognizing the genuine concern beneath her practical objections, even as he remained firm in his own convictions. "I appreciate your concern, Mother," he said, "for both myself and for Eleanor. But I have made my decision. I intend to continue courting her, and if things progress as I hope they will, I intend to make her my wife." Cordelia sighed, though a small measure of grudging respect flickered briefly across her expression. "Then I suppose there is little more to say on the matter, except to hope, for both your sakes, that you are prepared for whatever difficulties may lie ahead." Alexander left his mother's study that afternoon, with her warning weighing heavily on his mind, though his resolve remained unshaken. He did not yet know just how determined Lady Priscilla Vane truly was to ensure that his relationship with Eleanor never reached the altar, nor how far she was willing to go to see her scheme through to completion. But whatever challenges lay ahead, he found himself more certain than ever that Eleanor Hartley was worth facing them for. Word of Cordelia Whitmore's private conversation with her son, though intended to remain within the family, found its way to Priscilla Vane within a matter of days, carried by a servant loyal to Priscilla's household who maintained useful connections among the staff at the Whitmore townhouse. Priscilla listened to the report with growing frustration, realizing that her earlier attempts to plant doubt in the Dowager Duchess's mind, while somewhat effective, had not been enough to end Alexander's pursuit of Eleanor entirely. "He refuses to be swayed by practical concerns," Priscilla said to Sophia and Margaret Cole, who had gathered once again in her sitting room to discuss the increasingly troubling situation. "The Duchess herself raised objections, and still he insists on continuing this ridiculous courtship." "Perhaps it is truly love," Sophia offered hesitantly, though she quickly fell silent under Priscilla's sharp glare. "Love has very little to do with anything, Sophia," Priscilla snapped. "Men convince themselves of many things when a pretty voice and a sympathetic story capture their attention. Alexander simply requires a stronger reminder of what he stands to lose by pursuing this foolish attachment." Priscilla paced the length of her sitting room, her mind working through increasingly desperate possibilities. The gentle approach of spreading concerns about finances and family reputation had clearly not been sufficient. Something more direct was required, something that would create genuine doubt about Eleanor's character rather than simply her family's circumstances. "I have an idea," Priscilla said slowly, a calculating gleam entering her eyes. "Everyone knows of Eleanor's broken engagement from years ago. What if we suggested there was more to that story than has been publicly known? What if it were whispered that the engagement ended not because of her family's financial collapse, but because of some impropriety on Eleanor's part?" Margaret Cole's eyes widened with a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. "That would be quite a serious accusation, Priscilla, and entirely false, from what I understand of the situation." "The truth matters far less than what people believe to be true," Priscilla said coldly. "A well-placed rumor, delivered with just the right amount of hesitant reluctance, as though one were sharing information they wish they did not have to share, can accomplish a great deal. If enough doubt is cast upon Eleanor's character, even Alexander's stubborn devotion may begin to waver." Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Priscilla, this seems rather far beyond simply discouraging an unwanted match. Damaging a woman's reputation with false accusations could ruin her entirely, regardless of what happens with the Duke. Then perhaps you should consider whether your loyalty lies with me or with a woman who has never once shown either of you genuine friendship," Priscilla said sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. Sophia fell silent, though her uneasy expression remained. Over the following week, carefully constructed whispers began circulating through the capital's most influential drawing rooms, always delivered with practiced reluctance, always framed as concerned gossip, shared only because the listener seemed trustworthy enough to be told such delicate information in confidence. The rumors suggested, without ever stating anything too directly accusatory, that Eleanor Hartley's broken engagement years earlier had involved circumstances far more scandalous than a simple financial collapse, that perhaps the young lord in question had discovered something about Eleanor's character that had caused him to end things so abruptly. The rumors spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as they so often do within tightly connected social circles hungry for fresh gossip. By the time the whispers reached Eleanor's own ears, carried reluctantly by Charlotte Bell, who had heard the troubling rumors from her own mother, the damage had already begun to take root throughout much of the capital's high society. "I do not understand," Eleanor said, sitting across from Charlotte in the Hartley Manor sitting room, her face pale with shock and disbelief. "None of this is true. My engagement ended because my father's investments failed, nothing more. There was no scandal, no impropriety." "I know that, Eleanor," Charlotte said gently, reaching across to squeeze her friend's trembling hand. "But the rumors have spread quickly, and I fear they may reach the Duke's ears soon, if they have not already." Eleanor felt a cold, sick dread settling in her stomach at the thought. She had only just begun to allow herself to trust in the warmth and genuine affection building between herself and Alexander, had only just begun to believe that perhaps happiness was truly possible for her after so many years of quiet disappointment. Now, with these vicious lies spreading through the very society that would ultimately judge her worthiness to become the Duke's wife, she feared everything she had begun to hope for might crumble entirely. "Who would spread such cruel lies about me?" Eleanor asked, though even as she spoke the words, she suspected she already knew the answer. Charlotte hesitated, clearly reluctant to name names without certainty, but eventually sighed and admitted her suspicions. "I cannot say for certain, but I have heard that Lady Priscilla Vane has been rather vocal in certain circles regarding your unsuitability for the Duke's attentions." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, unsurprised but no less devastated by the confirmation. Of course it was Priscilla. She should have anticipated that the woman would not simply accept defeat gracefully after the humiliation she had suffered at the royal ball. "What am I to do?" Eleanor asked quietly, more to herself than to Charlotte, her earlier hope now tangled with fresh anxiety and fear. "You must speak with Alexander directly," Charlotte urged, "before these rumors reach him through less reliable sources. Tell him the truth yourself, before Priscilla's version of events has the chance to take hold in his mind." Eleanor knew Charlotte's advice was sound, but the thought of confronting Alexander with such an ugly topic, of having to defend herself against accusations that struck at the very heart of her character and reputation, filled her with a dread so profound it made her hands shake. What if, despite everything he had said to her in the garden, despite his passionate words about caring nothing for gossip or reputation, the weight of such rumors proved too heavy for even his stated convictions to withstand? What if this was the moment everything fell apart? That evening, Eleanor wrote a careful letter to Alexander, requesting his presence at Hartley Manor as soon as his schedule allowed, explaining only that a matter of some importance had arisen that she wished to discuss with him directly. She sent the letter by messenger before her courage could fail her entirely, then spent the following 2 days in a state of near constant anxiety, unable to focus on her needlework, her reading, or any of the small comforts that usually helped calm her troubled mind. Alexander arrived at Hartley Manor 2 days later, his expression concerned from the moment he stepped down from his carriage, clearly having sensed the seriousness in Eleanor's letter despite its careful vagueness. "Eleanor," he said, taking both her hands in his own the moment they were alone together in the garden, away from her mother's well-meaning but distracting presence. "What is troubling you? Your letter sounded quite urgent." Eleanor took a steadying breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "There are rumors circulating throughout the capital," she began, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Regarding my broken engagement from several years ago, I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly, before you might hear some distorted version from another source." "Tell me," Alexander said simply, his expression unreadable, but his grip on her hands remaining steady and reassuring. Eleanor recounted the entire story once more, the collapse of her father's investments, the sudden and unceremonious withdrawal of her betrothed's family from the engagement, the years of quiet humiliation and social mockery that had followed. "That is the entirety of the truth," she said finally. "There was no scandal, no impropriety on my part, whatever cruel version of events may be circulating through certain drawing rooms." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor's heart pounded anxiously as she waited for his response, fearing that even a moment's hesitation might signal doubt creeping into his mind. "I never doubted the truth of your story," Alexander said finally, his voice carrying quiet but fierce conviction. "Not for a single moment. Whatever rumors have begun circulating, Eleanor, I have complete faith in your character. I have watched you closely these past weeks. I have seen your kindness, your honesty, your quiet strength in the face of years of unkind treatment. No fabricated gossip could ever shake my belief in who you truly are." Relief flooded through Eleanor so powerfully that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "I feared you might hear these rumors and begin to doubt me," she admitted softly. "I could never doubt you," Alexander said, gently brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "But I confess, I am deeply troubled by whoever has chosen to spread such vicious lies. Do you have any suspicion of who might be responsible?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "Lady Priscilla Vane, though I have no direct proof, the timing and nature of the rumors seem to point clearly in her direction." Alexander's jaw tightened with anger at the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect himself. "Then Lady Priscilla will find that spreading falsehoods about the woman I intend to marry carries consequences she has not yet considered," he said, his voice carrying a hard edge Eleanor had not heard from him before. "You intend to marry me?" Eleanor asked, momentarily distracted from her earlier anxiety by the unexpected declaration, her heart suddenly racing for an entirely different reason. Alexander's expression softened immediately, a small, warm smile breaking through his earlier anger. "I had rather hoped to ask you that question in a far more romantic setting than this," he admitted. "But yes, Eleanor, I intend to marry you, if you will have me. These past weeks with you have shown me a kind of genuine happiness I had begun to believe I might never find." Despite the fear and uncertainty still swirling in the back of her mind regarding Priscilla's malicious rumors, Eleanor felt a joy so profound in that moment that it nearly overwhelmed every other emotion entirely. "Yes," she said softly, then more firmly. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He drew her gently into his arms, and for a long, precious moment, the troubles of gossip and scheming rivals felt distant and insignificant against the warmth of finally, truly being loved and chosen. But even as they stood together in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor knew that Priscilla Vane would not simply accept this outcome quietly, and that the path ahead, despite this beautiful moment, likely still held significant challenges yet to be faced. News of the engagement, once Alexander made it formally known to his mother and closest associates, spread through the capital with even greater speed than the earlier rumors Priscilla had so carefully cultivated. Within days, invitations began arriving at Hartley Manor for various social gatherings, many from families who had barely acknowledged Eleanor's existence in previous years, now suddenly eager to welcome the future Duchess of Whitmore into their social circles. Eleanor found the sudden shift both gratifying and slightly unsettling, aware that much of this newfound warmth stemmed not from any genuine change in how these families viewed her character, but simply from her association with Alexander's title and influence. Still, she allowed herself to enjoy this new chapter of her life, grateful for the happiness that had so unexpectedly found her after years of quiet loneliness. Priscilla Vane, upon learning of the formal engagement, felt her earlier frustration curdle into something far more desperate and dangerous. Her carefully planted rumors had failed to achieve their intended purpose. If anything, Alexander's public defense of Eleanor's character, delivered firmly and without hesitation, whenever the malicious gossip was mentioned in his presence, had only strengthened public sympathy toward Eleanor, while casting suspicion increasingly toward Priscilla herself as the likely source of such vicious lies. "I will not simply accept this outcome," Priscilla declared to Sophia and Margaret Cole during another tense gathering in her sitting room, though Sophia's earlier reluctance had grown into something closer to genuine discomfort with the entire scheme. "There must be something more decisive we can do." "Priscilla," Sophia said carefully, "perhaps it is time to accept that this match is simply meant to be. The Duke has made his feelings toward Eleanor abundantly clear, and continuing to interfere risks damaging your own reputation far more than hers at this point. My reputation will recover just fine once Eleanor Hartley is exposed for the fraud she truly is, Priscilla snapped, though even she seemed less certain of her own conviction than she had been weeks earlier. An upcoming garden party, hosted by one of the capital's most influential families and set to be attended by nearly every notable figure in society, including the king and queen themselves, presented Priscilla with what she believed might be her final opportunity to derail the engagement before it progressed any further toward an official wedding announcement. She spent the following days carefully constructing a plan, one considerably more direct and dangerous than her earlier whispered rumors. Priscilla had learned, through her network of well-placed servants and social connections, that Eleanor's former betrothed, the young lord who had abandoned her years earlier following her family's financial collapse, now lived not far from the capital and occasionally attended similar social gatherings. His name was Lord Frederick Ellington, and Priscilla arranged, through a series of carefully worded letters and generous financial incentives, to ensure his attendance at the upcoming garden party. She intended to orchestrate a public confrontation between Eleanor and her former betrothed, hoping that whatever awkward or painful history existed between them might be exploited to cast further doubt on Eleanor's suitability, or at the very least, create a scene embarrassing enough to give Alexander and his family reason to reconsider the match. The day of the garden party arrived bright and warm, the grand estate's extensive grounds filled with elegantly dressed guests, strolling among manicured hedges and blooming flower beds, while musicians played gently in the background. Eleanor arrived on Alexander's arm, dressed in a soft green gown that complemented her auburn hair beautifully, feeling more confident and secure in her place within this glittering world than she ever had before. They had barely made their way through the initial round of greetings and polite conversation when Eleanor felt a sudden, uncomfortable prickle of recognition as her eyes fell upon a familiar face across the crowded lawn. Frederick Ellington stood near one of the refreshment tables, looking somewhat older than she remembered but unmistakably himself, his expression shifting to surprise and evident discomfort as he too recognized her. "Eleanor," Alexander said, noticing her sudden stillness beside him. "Is something wrong?" Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Priscilla appeared as though summoned, her timing far too perfect to be coincidental. "Why, Lady Eleanor," Priscilla said brightly, loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby guests. "What a coincidence that Lord Ellington should be in attendance today. I understand the two of you share quite a significant history together." Eleanor felt her stomach twist with dread, as several guests nearby turned curious eyes toward the unfolding scene, clearly sensing the possibility of interesting gossip about to unfold. Alexander's expression grew alert and watchful beside her, his hand tightening protectively around her own. "Lord Ellington," Eleanor said carefully, forcing herself to remain composed despite the sudden churning anxiety in her stomach. "It has been many years." "Lady Eleanor," Frederick replied stiffly, clearly as uncomfortable with this unexpected confrontation as she was. "I had heard of your engagement to the Duke. Congratulations are in order, I suppose." "Do tell us, Lord Ellington," Priscilla pressed, her voice carrying easily across the small gathering crowd. "What exactly led to the end of your own engagement to Lady Eleanor all those years ago? I confess, I have heard several different accounts, and I would love to finally understand the truth of the matter." Frederick's face flushed with obvious discomfort at being put on the spot so publicly, his eyes darting nervously between Eleanor, Alexander, and the growing crowd of curious onlookers now gathering to witness the unfolding drama.
"It was a difficult time for both families," he said hesitantly.
"Financial circumstances made the match impractical." "Merely financial circumstances?" Priscilla pressed further, clearly disappointed that Frederick's answer had not provided the scandalous confirmation she had hoped for. "I had heard there were other, more delicate reasons for the engagement's dissolution." "I do not know what rumors you may have heard, Lady Priscilla," Frederick said, his discomfort now shifting toward mild irritation. "But I assure you, the engagement ended solely due to my family's concerns regarding the Hartley family's financial collapse. Lady Eleanor's character was never in question. If anything, I have long regretted how the entire matter was handled, and I have often thought that my family behaved rather poorly toward her during a difficult time." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the gathered crowd at Frederick's unexpectedly honest and sympathetic admission, clearly not the outcome Priscilla had anticipated when orchestrating this confrontation. "I appreciate your honesty, Lord Ellington," Eleanor said quietly, finding her voice again amid the tense atmosphere. "Though I assure you, I harbor no lingering resentment toward you personally. We were both young, and circumstances beyond our control shaped decisions that were, I imagine, difficult for everyone involved." Frederick nodded, looking genuinely relieved by her gracious response. "You are more generous than I likely deserve, Lady Eleanor. I wish you and the Duke every happiness." Priscilla, watching her carefully orchestrated confrontation collapse before her eyes, felt desperation clawing at her composure. She had been so certain that forcing this public encounter would produce some scandalous revelation or awkward scene damaging enough to shake Alexander's confidence in Eleanor. Instead, she had only succeeded in demonstrating publicly just how baseless her earlier rumors had truly been. "Well," Priscilla said, her voice growing slightly shrill despite her best efforts to maintain composure, "how very touching, though I still find it curious that such a devoted couple would separate so easily over mere financial difficulties. Surely true affection would have weathered such a minor obstacle." Alexander, who had remained largely silent throughout the uncomfortable exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying a cold, controlled anger that immediately silenced the surrounding murmurs. "Lady Priscilla," he said, "I find myself increasingly curious about your persistent interest in Eleanor's personal history. One might almost suspect you have been the source of certain unpleasant rumors that have circulated recently regarding her character." Priscilla's face paled slightly at the direct accusation, delivered so calmly and confidently before the very crowd she had hoped to use against Eleanor. "I am certain I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confident edge. "I believe you know precisely what I mean," Alexander continued, his gaze unwavering. "And I would advise you, quite strongly, to reconsider any further attempts to interfere with matters that do not concern you. Eleanor's character has been thoroughly vindicated today, by her own former betrothed no less, and I have no doubt that further scheming on your part will only continue to reflect poorly upon yourself rather than upon her." The crowd around them had grown considerably larger during this exchange, and Eleanor could feel dozens of eyes watching the confrontation with rapt attention, could sense the shift in public opinion happening in real time as Priscilla's scheme unraveled publicly before everyone present. Priscilla, recognizing that any further response would only deepen her humiliation, offered a stiff, insincere smile and excused herself from the gathering entirely, disappearing quickly into the crowd with Sophia and Margaret Cole trailing uncertainly behind her. As the tension of the confrontation slowly dissipated and normal conversation gradually resumed around them, Eleanor turned to Alexander with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. "Do you think she will attempt something else?" she asked quietly. "Perhaps," Alexander admitted, "though I suspect today's events have significantly damaged whatever credibility she once held within these social circles. Still, I will remain watchful. I do not intend to let anyone threaten our happiness so easily, Eleanor." Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength and comfort from his steady, unwavering support. Whatever challenges Priscilla might still attempt to create, Eleanor found herself facing them now with far greater confidence than she would have possessed only weeks earlier, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer facing such difficulties alone. In the days following the garden party, word of Priscilla's failed scheme and Alexander's pointed public accusation spread through the capital nearly as quickly as her original rumors had. Society, ever fickle in its loyalties, began turning sharply against Priscilla. Many families who had once eagerly sought her friendship, now finding sudden reasons to distance themselves from association with such transparent scheming. Lady Sophia Ellery, troubled by weeks of guilt over her participation in the scheme, finally confessed the full extent of Priscilla's plotting to her own mother, who in turn felt compelled to share the information more broadly among their social circle, unable to bear the weight of such knowledge in silence. Within a week, it became widely known throughout the capital that Priscilla Vane had been the source of the malicious rumors surrounding Eleanor's character, and that she had gone so far as to bribe Lord Ellington's attendance at the garden party in a calculated attempt to publicly humiliate her rival. Priscilla's own family, embarrassed by the scandal now attached to their name, quietly withdrew her from several upcoming social engagements, and her once celebrated status as the season's most sought-after beauty faded rapidly beneath the weight of public disapproval. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in witnessing Priscilla's downfall, though she could not deny a measure of relief that the woman's schemes had finally been exposed and neutralized. Meanwhile, at Hartley Manor, preparations for the upcoming wedding had begun in earnest. The Dowager Duchess Cordelia Whitmore, having witnessed firsthand at the garden party the genuine devotion between her son and Eleanor, as well as the graceful dignity with which Eleanor had handled Priscilla's cruel and public scheme, found her earlier reservations gradually softening into something closer to genuine respect and warmth. "I owe you an apology, Eleanor," Cordelia said one afternoon, having called upon Hartley Manor unannounced, much to Eleanor's initial surprise. "I allowed practical concerns and social pressures to cloud my judgment regarding your character. Watching you handle Lady Priscilla's cruel scheming with such grace and composure has shown me that my son's affection for you is entirely justified." "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, genuinely moved by the unexpected apology from a woman she had assumed might never fully accept her. "I understand your concerns were born from love for your son and care for your family's standing. I hold no resentment toward you for wanting to protect what matters most to you." Cordelia studied Eleanor for a long moment, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her usually reserved expression. "You possess a remarkable capacity for grace, my dear. Alexander is fortunate indeed to have found you. I look forward to welcoming you properly into our family." As autumn deepened into the crisp early days of winter, Eleanor and Alexander spent countless hours together planning their upcoming wedding, a grand celebration that would take place in the spring, once the harshest cold had passed and the palace gardens had begun blooming again with fresh flowers. Eleanor found herself constantly amazed by how completely her life had transformed in such a relatively short span of time, from the quiet, overlooked spinster mocked at balls to a woman now preparing to become Duchess of one of the kingdom's most influential families. Yet amid all the joyful preparations, Eleanor made certain never to forget the years of loneliness and quiet heartache that had shaped her into the woman she had become. She insisted on continuing her regular visits to a small orphanage on the outskirts of the capital, a charitable cause she had quietly supported for several years, even during her most difficult financial circumstances, believing that her own experiences with feeling unwanted and overlooked had given her a unique capacity for empathy toward children facing similar struggles. Alexander, upon learning of her ongoing charitable work, insisted on accompanying her during several visits, deeply moved by the genuine warmth and patience Eleanor showed toward the orphan children, many of whom had grown quite attached to her regular presence in their lives. "You continue to surprise me," Alexander said one afternoon as they walked away from the orphanage together, watching several children waving enthusiastically from the windows behind them. "Even now, with a wedding to plan and a new life awaiting you, you make time for those who need kindness most. I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to feel as though you have little worth in the eyes of the world," Eleanor said softly. "I could never turn away from children experiencing that same pain, especially not now that I have been given so much." Alexander drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "This is precisely why I fell in love with you, Eleanor. Not simply your voice, beautiful as it is, but the depth of kindness and genuine care you carry within your heart." As winter gave way slowly to the first tender signs of spring, wedding preparations intensified throughout the kingdom, with excitement building not only within the Hartley and Whitmore households but throughout much of the capital as well. The story of the overlooked spinster who had captured the heart of the Duke through nothing more than the honest beauty of her singing voice had become something of a beloved tale throughout the kingdom, inspiring hope in countless other women who had similarly begun to believe society's harsh judgments regarding their own worth. Eleanor received numerous letters from strangers throughout these months, women who had heard her story and wished to share their own experiences of feeling overlooked or dismissed by society's narrow expectations. She made a point of responding personally to as many as she could manage, offering words of encouragement and hope drawn from her own hard-won understanding that true worth had nothing to do with age, fortune, or society's fickle approval. Priscilla Vane, meanwhile, having retreated largely from public society following the scandal surrounding her scheme, sent an unexpected letter to Hartley Manor as spring finally arrived in full bloom. Eleanor opened the letter with cautious curiosity, uncertain what to expect from a woman who had caused her such significant pain and difficulty over the preceding months. The letter, surprisingly, contained a genuine apology. Priscilla wrote of her own insecurities, Her fear of losing her carefully cultivated social standing, her jealousy over watching Alexander's genuine affection develop for a woman she had spent years dismissing as unworthy of notice. She acknowledged the cruelty of her actions and expressed sincere regret for the pain she had caused, though she did not ask for friendship or forgiveness, seeming to understand that such things could not simply be requested and granted so easily, after everything that had transpired between them. Eleanor considered the letter carefully for several days before finally responding, choosing her words with the same grace and composure she had maintained throughout the entire difficult ordeal. She wrote that she accepted Priscilla's apology, that she understood, in some small way, the fear and insecurity that could drive a person toward such destructive behavior, though she made clear that trust, once broken so severely, would take considerable time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. She wished Priscilla genuine happiness and growth in the years ahead, hoping that the younger woman might eventually find within herself the same quiet strength and self-worth that Eleanor herself had spent years learning to embrace. As the day of the wedding finally approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From a lonely woman mocked and dismissed at a royal ball, to a bride preparing to marry a man who saw and valued every part of who she truly was. She thought often of her grandmother, wishing desperately that the woman who had first taught her to sing, who had first instilled in her the belief that her worth extended far beyond society's narrow judgments, could have lived to witness this joyful culmination of everything she had once quietly hoped for her granddaughter. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the palace gardens blooming magnificently with fresh spring flowers, the air filled with bird song and gentle warmth. Eleanor stood before her mirror in her wedding chamber, dressed in an elegant ivory gown that had been carefully designed to complement her natural beauty, without unnecessary ornamentation. Her auburn hair, arranged simply but elegantly around her face. "You look radiant, my darling," Margaret said, tears of joy already gathering in her eyes as she helped adjust the final details of Eleanor's gown. "I only wish your grandmother could be here to see this day." "I believe she is here, in her own way," Eleanor said softly, thinking of the old, cherished melody she had chosen to sing during a small, private moment planned for later in the wedding ceremony, a tribute to the woman who had given her the gift that had ultimately led to this remarkable turn in her life's story. As Eleanor prepared to walk toward her future, toward the man who had seen her true worth when society had chosen only to mock and dismiss her, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her heart, a quiet certainty that every difficult year of loneliness and quiet heartache had ultimately led her, step by careful step, toward exactly this moment of joy and belonging. The grand cathedral in the heart of the capital had never looked more magnificent, its tall stone arches decorated with garlands of white roses and delicate spring blossoms, sunlight streaming through the ancient stained glass windows and casting soft, colorful patterns across the gathered guests below. Nearly every notable family in the kingdom had been invited, filling the long wooden pews with elegant finery and hushed, excited anticipation. Alexander stood at the front of the cathedral, beside the officiating bishop, dressed in formal attire befitting his station, his expression a careful mixture of composed dignity and barely contained excitement. Beside him stood Lord Henry Ashby, his closest friend and confidant, who had witnessed the entire remarkable journey, from that first fateful glance across the crowded ballroom to this culminating moment. Henry whispered with a small, knowing smile. "More excited than nervous," Alexander admitted quietly. "I have waited a long time to find someone who makes me feel the way Eleanor does. I do not intend to waste another moment of uncertainty." The great cathedral doors swung open, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd as Eleanor appeared at the entrance, her hand resting gently on her mother's arm, her ivory gown catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows in a way that made her appear almost luminous. Margaret's own eyes glistened with tears of pride and joy as she walked her daughter down the long aisle, toward the future that had once seemed so impossibly out of reach. Eleanor's eyes found Alexander's the moment she stepped into the cathedral, and everything else, the watching crowd, the beautiful decorations, the weight of so many eyes upon her, seemed to fade into soft, unimportant background as she focused entirely on the warm, steady love reflected in his gaze. She thought, as she walked slowly down the aisle, of every painful moment that had led her to this point, the years of quiet mockery, the broken engagement, the countless balls where she had stood alone by tall windows while others danced and laughed around her. None of that pain had disappeared entirely, she knew, but it no longer defined her, no longer held the same power over her heart that it once had. When she finally reached the front of the cathedral, Alexander stepped forward to take her hand from her mother, his eyes bright with unmistakable emotion. "You are more beautiful than I could have possibly imagined," he whispered, just for her. "Thank you for seeing me," Eleanor whispered back, when so many others chose not to. The ceremony proceeded with quiet, dignified beauty, the bishop's words carrying clearly through the vast stone cathedral, as Alexander and Eleanor exchanged their vows before family, friends, and the entire assembled kingdom. When the moment came for them to speak their own personal promises to one another, as was tradition among noble families of the realm, Alexander turned to face Eleanor fully, his voice steady and clear. "Eleanor," he began, "when I first heard your voice at the royal ball, I believed I was simply witnessing remarkable talent. I did not yet understand that I was witnessing the true character of an extraordinary woman, one who had endured years of unkind judgment, with grace and quiet strength I have rarely encountered in anyone else. I promise to spend the rest of my life ensuring you never again feel overlooked or unwanted, to cherish every part of who you are, and to stand beside you through whatever challenges life may yet bring us." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to his heartfelt promise, and when it came her turn to speak, she found her voice trembling slightly with emotion, though she pressed forward with quiet determination. "Alexander," she said, "for many years I believed my story had already been written, that I was destined to remain overlooked, unwanted, defined only by what society believed I lacked. You showed me that my worth was never determined by such narrow judgments, that I was capable of being truly seen and valued for exactly who I am. I promise to love you faithfully, to support you through every challenge your position may bring, and to remind you always that true happiness is found not in titles or fortune, but in genuine connection and shared kindness." As the bishop pronounced them formally married, the entire cathedral erupted into joyful applause, and Alexander drew Eleanor into a warm, gentle embrace, sealing their vows with a tender kiss that drew even louder cheers from the assembled crowd. Eleanor caught sight of her mother weeping openly with joy near the front pews, of Charlotte Bell beaming with genuine happiness for her dear friend, and even, somewhat unexpectedly, of Priscilla Vane seated quietly near the back of the cathedral, her expression unreadable, but notably free of her earlier bitterness. Following the ceremony, guests gathered in the grand palace ballroom, the very same room where Eleanor had once stood humiliated and mocked, now transformed for an entirely different purpose, decorated magnificently for the wedding celebration that would stretch long into the evening. Eleanor found the symmetry almost overwhelming as she entered the familiar space on her new husband's arm, remembering vividly the fear and shame she had felt walking through these same doors on the night of the royal ball, now replaced entirely by joy and belonging. As tradition demanded, the newly married couple opened the celebration with the first dance, moving together gracefully across the polished ballroom floor, while the assembled guests watched with warm approval. Eleanor felt none of the anxious self-consciousness that had plagued her during previous balls, secure now in the knowledge that she belonged here, that she had earned her place not through desperate striving for society's approval, but simply by remaining true to herself, through even the most difficult circumstances. Later in the evening, as the celebration continued with music, dancing, and abundant laughter, Alexander requested a quiet moment of the crowd's attention, drawing everyone's focus toward the small musical platform where the orchestra had been performing throughout the celebration. "My wife," he announced, his voice carrying warmly through the ballroom, using the title with evident pride and joy, "possesses a truly remarkable gift that I believe deserves to be shared once more with everyone gathered here tonight." Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of nervous anticipation as all eyes turned toward her, though this time the feeling carried none of the dread she had experienced on the night of the royal ball. This time, she felt only genuine excitement to share something meaningful with the people who had gathered to celebrate her happiness. She stepped toward the platform, and the musicians began the same gentle melody she had sung all those months earlier, the old song her grandmother had taught her so many years before. As her voice rose once again through the grand ballroom, carrying the same depth of emotion and beauty that had first captured Alexander's heart, The entire room fell into the same rapt, appreciative silence it had before, though this time free of any cruelty or malicious anticipation, filled instead with genuine warmth and admiration. When the song concluded, the applause that followed was thunderous, and Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers offering heartfelt congratulations, many of them the very same guests who had once whispered cruel words about her unmarried status, now genuinely moved by witnessing the full arc of her remarkable journey from overlooked spinster to celebrated duchess. Near the edge of the crowd, Priscilla Vane approached hesitantly, her expression carrying genuine humility rather than her earlier calculated charm. "Your Grace," she said quietly, using Eleanor's new title with evident sincerity, "your voice remains as beautiful as ever. I am glad, truly, that you have found such happiness." Eleanor studied Priscilla for a long moment, searching for any remaining trace of the earlier malice and cruelty that had once defined their interactions. Finding instead only quiet, genuine humility, she offered the younger woman a small, gracious smile. "Thank you, Lady Priscilla. I hope you find your own happiness as well, in time." Priscilla nodded, clearly moved by the unexpected kindness, before retreating quietly back into the crowd, leaving Eleanor to return her full attention to the joyful celebration surrounding her, to her new husband's warm, loving presence beside her, and to the bright, hopeful future now stretching out before them both. As the celebration finally began winding down in the late hours of the evening, Alexander drew Eleanor aside for a quiet moment near the same tall windows where she had once stood alone, dreading the humiliation Priscilla had planned for her. "Do you remember standing here, that first night?" Alexander asked softly, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "I remember every moment of it," Eleanor said, leaning contentedly against him. "The fear, the shame, the certainty that I would never be more than what society had already decided I was. And now?" Alexander asked. Eleanor looked out over the glittering ballroom, filled with warmth, celebration, and genuine happiness, then turned to meet her husband's loving gaze. "Now I understand that my story was never truly finished, no matter what anyone else believed. It was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal what had been true about me all along." Years passed, and life at the Grand Whitmore estate settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment that Eleanor had once believed impossible for someone of her circumstances. As Duchess, she carried her new responsibilities with the same grace and steady dignity that had first captured Alexander's attention that night at the royal ball, earning genuine respect and admiration throughout the kingdom, not merely for her title, but for the person she consistently proved herself to be. The small orphanage on the outskirts of the capital, which Eleanor had continued visiting even after her marriage, grew significantly under her patronage, expanding to house and educate far more children than it ever had before her involvement. She established a music program there, teaching the children to sing not for performance or public approval, but for the same simple joy and comfort her grandmother had once given her. Several of these children, now grown, would later speak of Eleanor's gentle influence as having shaped the entire course of their lives, showing them that circumstances of birth or fortune need never determine one's ultimate worth or potential. Cordelia Whitmore, the Dowager Duchess who had once expressed such serious reservations about her son's choice of bride, grew to love Eleanor as though she were truly her own daughter, often remarking to close friends that she considered herself fortunate indeed that Alexander had possessed the wisdom and courage to follow his heart, despite her own initial hesitations. The two women developed a close, warm relationship over the years, with Cordelia frequently seeking out Eleanor's company and counsel on various family matters. Margaret Hartley, Eleanor's devoted mother, lived to see her daughter's happiness flourish for many years, often visiting the Grand Whitmore estate and marveling, even after considerable time had passed, at how completely her daughter's fortunes had transformed from that painful period of social mockery and quiet desperation. She would tell anyone who asked, with evident pride, the story of her daughter's remarkable courage on the night of the royal ball, of how a single moment of quiet bravery had ultimately reshaped an entire life's trajectory. As for Lady Priscilla Vane, the years that followed brought a gradual but genuine transformation in her character. Humbled significantly by the scandal surrounding her scheming and the subsequent damage to her social standing, she withdrew from the more competitive aspects of high society life, eventually finding genuine happiness in a quieter marriage to a kind country gentleman who valued her for qualities entirely separate from the calculated social ambition that had once defined her youth. She and Eleanor never became close friends, the earlier wounds too significant to fully heal into genuine intimacy, but they maintained a respectful, distant cordiality whenever their paths crossed at various social gatherings over the years, each acknowledging in her own way the strange, difficult journey that had once bound their fates together so tightly. Eleanor's story, the tale of the overlooked spinster who had been mocked so cruelly at the royal ball, only to capture the heart of the kingdom's most eligible duke through nothing more than the honest beauty of her singing voice, became something of a legend throughout the realm in the years that followed. Mothers told the story to their daughters who feared they might never find happiness or acceptance. Young women who felt overlooked by society's narrow standards found comfort and hope in the tale, understanding that true worth extended far beyond the arbitrary judgments of any particular season or gathering. Eleanor herself never fully understood why her story resonated so deeply with so many people, though she suspected it had something to do with the universal fear so many carried within themselves, the quiet dread of being overlooked, dismissed, or judged unworthy by a world that often valued surface qualities over genuine character. She made a point, throughout her years as Duchess, of speaking openly and honestly whenever asked about her earlier struggles, believing that her willingness to share the full truth of her painful years might offer genuine comfort and hope to others facing similar difficulties. On quiet evenings, when the demands of her Duchess duties allowed for peaceful reflection, Eleanor would often find herself back in the gardens of the Whitmore estate, sometimes joined by Alexander, sometimes simply enjoying solitary contemplation among the carefully tended flowers that reminded her still of her beloved grandmother's gardens at Hartley Manor. She would occasionally hum the old melody, the song about winter roses and patient hope that had first drawn Alexander's attention on that fateful night so many years earlier, marveling still at how completely a single moment of courage had transformed the entire remaining course of her life. Their marriage, in the years that followed, welcomed 2 children into the world, a son who inherited his father's steady, thoughtful temperament, and a daughter who displayed, from a remarkably young age, the same natural gift for music that had once defined her mother's hidden talent. Eleanor took particular joy in teaching her daughter to sing, passing down the same cherished melodies her own grandmother had taught her, ensuring that the precious gift and the values attached to it would continue flowing through generations of their family. Alexander, for his part, never once regretted the decision he had made that night at the royal ball, choosing to pursue genuine connection over society's calculated expectations regarding suitable matches. He often told their children, as they grew older, the story of how their mother's courage in the face of cruel mockery had first captured his heart, emphasizing always the lesson that true character revealed itself most clearly, not during comfortable, easy moments, but during difficult trials that tested a person's genuine strength and integrity. Your mother, he would tell them, taught me that worth has nothing to do with what others believe about you, and everything to do with the courage you show in remaining true to yourself, even when the entire world seems determined to convince you otherwise. Eleanor, listening to her husband share this wisdom with their children, would often reflect on how far she had traveled from that frightened, humiliated young woman, standing alone near the tall windows of the royal ball, certain that her life had already been decided, that she would remain forever overlooked and unwanted by a world too narrow-minded to recognize her true value. She thought, too, of all the other women throughout the kingdom who might still be standing in similar shadows, believing themselves forgotten, unworthy, past whatever arbitrary deadline society had assigned to their happiness. To each of them, had she been given the chance to speak directly, Eleanor would have offered the same simple but hard-won wisdom that had ultimately transformed her own life. That a person's story is never truly finished simply because others have decided to stop paying attention, that genuine courage often reveals itself in the quietest, most unexpected moments, and that sometimes, against every discouraging expectation the world might place upon us, love and recognition arrive precisely when we have finally learned to stop waiting for permission to be seen. As the years passed and Eleanor's own children grew into adulthood, eventually finding their own paths toward love and happiness, she remained, throughout her long and fulfilling life as Duchess, a quiet but powerful reminder throughout the kingdom that true worth could never be measured by age, fortune, or society's fickle approval, but only by the depth of character, and genuine kindness a person carried within their heart. And whenever she was asked, in later years, to reflect upon the remarkable turning point that had reshaped her entire destiny, she would simply smile, remembering that trembling but determined young woman who had once dared to sing before a room full of people who believed she had nothing worth offering the world. And she would say, with quiet, unwavering certainty, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. And so, in the grand halls of Whitmore Estate, surrounded by the family and legacy she had built from what once seemed like nothing but quiet heartache and lonely disappointment, Eleanor Hartley Whitmore lived out her days as living proof that even the most overlooked and unwanted stories can, with courage and unwavering authenticity, transform into something truly and beautifully unforgettable.